For my book talk this week, I'm actually going to get into the philosophy of Plotinus, or at least, the parts that I think are interesting. I'm not going to be covering every aspect of what was taught, of what he taught, and how it relates to Plato or other philosophers throughout history. I will be comparing him to shamanic thought, experience, and other overlaps between Plotinus and that sort of tradition. Beyond that, there's going to be plenty that's left out. So if you want more, read a book, watch an actual philosopher talk about him. I'm just a guy. I do think we can get a good sense of a boiled down version of Plotinus's philosophy by quoting him directly when he said, "Shut your eyes and change to and wake another way of seeing, which everyone has, but few use." To start things off here, let's give a brief biography of just who we're talking about. Plotinus, he was a philosopher who lived in the Roman Empire. He was born in Egypt in the year 204 or 205 AD and died in the year 270. He is regarded as the founder, so to speak, of the philosophical movement called Neoplatonism. This is a much later derivative of the work of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. And again, just note here, I'm not going to be really diving into Plato's thought or the differences between him and Plotinus. I'm not an expert, and while I've read some about it, I don't have enough of a grasp of the topic to do it justice. Plus, it's not entirely relevant to the aspects of Plotinus's philosophy that I actually want to talk about. And this is a solipsistic podcast. It's about me. No one else exists. However, I will say that Plotinus accepts Plato's idea of the forms, but he takes them in a different direction and probably isn't a completely accurate interpreter of the earlier man's work. Though, beyond just getting ideas from Plato, Plotinus is also incorporating ideas from the Near East, India, and just that general region. In some ways, it's a fusion of the two sources, but people have debated about how much influence in Neoplatonism is from outside of Plato's thought itself. Anyway, Plotinus, he was born in Egypt, but it's most likely he was a Greek, as that's what his native language was, and the tradition that his education was most derived from. He apparently didn't start his study of philosophy until age 28, when he went to Alexandria and began as a student under Ammonius Saccas. He taught Plotinus for 11 years. He's a pretty late starter, and the biographical detail is pretty scant about his earlier life, mainly since he never liked to talk about himself or his heritage, and didn't have very much love for material things in general. One of the anecdotes that did survive that made me laugh, that we get from the life of Plotinus, I think is student Porphyry is the one who records this. He said, quote, "Even though he was already going to school and was 8 years old, he still used to go to his nursemaid and uncover her breast so as to suckle." I guess that's supposed to make him look like a baby or some sort of sensitive kid. Or a dork, but who doesn't want a fat titty to suck on? That just makes me like him even more. I would still go on suck on titties at my age if it were available to me. Once Plotinus does his 11 years of training under his teacher, he's about 38 years old, 39, and decides he wants to study the philosophy of Persia in India. He joins the army of Gordian III, the emperor of Rome at the time. Never heard of him, but apparently he was emperor. He joins him for the emperor's invasion of Persia, and shit went sideways really fast. Plotinus ends up stranded for a long time before eventually getting himself back into the Roman Empire and finally onto Rome itself. And this, after that adventure or misadventure, is when he begins his teaching. Now, for this segment, I'm going to be pulling information and quotes from multiple books. Much of it will be from Pierre Hadot's The Simplicity of Vision. And from that one, he talks about Plotinus's living arrangement, which was also somewhat strange. He writes, quote, "It has often been said that Plotinus lived within a narrow, confined circle. Joseph Bedez speaks of a conventicule, a little cenacle of pale, cloistered people." So instead of the famed polycule, we have a conventicule. I guess it was a school of some kind once he was a philosopher and out on his own. Hadot also says that at the time, quote, "the philosopher was less of a professor than a spiritual guide. He exhorted his charges to conversion, and then directed his new converts, often adults as well as young people, to the paths of wisdom. He was a spiritual advisor." He had all sorts of students, including Porphyry, which is his most well-known student, but his school was also open to women and children too. One thing that I'm pretty jealous of is Plotinus's memory and his ability that he showed for getting his ideas organized and thought out before setting them down in writing. That's what I've always been trying to get done with my memory improvement practices this year. All my note-taking and whatnot. It's said that of Plotinus in the Pierre Hadot book, he used to complete his theoretical inquiries within himself from beginning to end, and then commit the results of his reflections to writing, and string them together, writing down what he had stored up in his soul in such a way that he seemed to be copying straight out of a book. He would pick up where he left off, as if no time had elapsed from the time when he was carrying off the conversation. Thus, he was simultaneously present to both himself and to others. And as a completion to his biography, another summation of his philosophical thought from the book called The Heart of Plotinus, quote, "Plotinus produced and developed a philosophical discourse aimed at liberation from the realm of becoming and the realization of one's true divine identity." To start off with the aspects of Plotinus's thought, I thought that I want to cover here, I think I have to begin with the concept of the one. So, everything is the one. It's everywhere and nowhere as it permeates all things. We are all the one. Also, we're all part of the one, but not exactly the same as the one. There is a separation or distinction from our being and the one itself. So Brian Hines' book called The One, in his book he writes, quote, "The one for Plotinus is unequivocally and indisputably one. It is the root of everything in existence, for the one is both the source of being and the ground of being, even though, as we will learn, it's also beyond being. So at a deep mystical level, you are the one, I am the one, this book you are holding is the one, and everything else outside and inside of us is the one." Then to continue from Pierre Hadot's book, quote, "The one is the ground of ultimate source of spiritual life because it is pure, simple, undecomposable presence." It does get abstract since there isn't an actual form that you can point out to or a simple way of explaining the one as a concept in language in that simple phrase alone. But you know, language, you have to make some sacrifices to get your point across simply, as simple as possible. And the book, The Heart of Plotinus, continues on that the term the one does not really describe the principle, which is beyond form. It is therefore false to even say of it that it is one. Being formless and infinite, the one, as a perfect actuality, contains everything and lacks nothing, thus having the supreme power to generate the noetic world. The core of who you are is the core of everything. So they're all the same. The surface level of the physical form is a part of it, but it's also distinct from it. We're not particularly satisfied in this life because nothing is real on the surface. The physical forms are there, but it's illusory, as it's all really the one. And Brian Hines in his book writes, "We are shadows trying to drink from a mirage. We're in love with reflections. We're starving for reality, but continue to devour illusion. Not surprisingly, we're never satiated." How we get out of this is spelled out in more detail, but Hines also lays out a pretty easy roadmap of part of the Aeneads by Plotinus. That's basically the main book containing his writings, where we can see how we get to experience the one. Hines writes, "A central message of the Aeneads is that the basic itinerary of our return to the one is to know ourselves first as soul, then spirit, and finally as the source, God, the one." We're not becoming the one in this. It's not melting into it as a complete unity, even though we are the one. It is something that is still distinct from being itself, and again, beyond it. Our being is a part of the world of forms. It's a category within it. The one is not a form. It's beyond being. So moving off of that, the next part of this is going to be the virtues. And again, I'm going to lay out the basic segments of the thought of Plotinus's thought here, and then try to tie it into, again, shamanism and my thoughts on all this. But let's get this out of the way. Let's do the virtues, the body, and the material world as a whole. So the virtues of Plotinus do stem somewhat from Plato, but again, they're different. His is sort of categorized into two different groups. What you would call social virtues like justice and temperance, those are for day-to-day existence. So if you don't strictly adhere to these virtues, it doesn't damage the soul itself. Hadow in his book says, for example, he does not postulate temperance as moderation. Rather, he detaches himself completely insofar as it is possible. He does not live the life of a man, even of a good man, as the latter is defined by civic virtue. He leaves this kind of life behind and chooses another, the life of the gods. Instead, it can make it more difficult to ascend to a state of perfection, because our attention is, we're too focused on the material and tied up into the illusion of the world instead of focusing on uniting to that higher level of consciousness. So practicing virtue in that sense is really just cutting out the distractions. You're practicing temperance and justice as a way to simplify and purify yourself in order, not so that you can be good as a man or a woman in this realm, is that so you can have the ability to transcend to the one, to commune with the one. According to Plotinus himself, he says, quote, "Our concern is not to be free of sin, but to be God." In the book, The Heart of Plotinus, the author breaks it down even further, that the soul must become all things. However, soul is not a fixed entity. Rather, it's a label for a variety of psychic and intellectual activities. So the social virtues regulate the physical human form, the composite of who we are. As Hadow puts it, the day-to-day pleasures and pains belong to the composite form, but you're not supposed to identify with them. The real concern here is divine presence and seeing it within oneself, within the composite, the soul, within all other things. As Pierre Hadow writes in The Simplicity of Vision, quote, "By the practice of the virtues, the soul can rise up once more to the intellect. In other words, to a purely spiritual life. Once she reaches the state of perfection, virtue becomes wisdom, a stable state, from which the soul may once again render herself ready for divine union." He then describes the second type of virtues. Above these social virtues are the purificatory virtues, if I can pronounce that right. Through these, again quoting him, "Through these, the soul, instead of forming a composite whole with the body, which is what the social virtues promote, separates herself radically from it and turns all of her attention towards God. These two movements are moreover inseparable." I guess since he brings up God here all the time, I do have to point out Plotinus is not Christian. Even though there's some later Christian thinkers or mystics that incorporate his thought, or even people that try to claim him as a Christian and the union of the one, he's not. Within Plotinus's thought, there isn't a beating yourself up over what happens in the material world or your day-to-day life. Earthly things don't harm the soul, but it's more of a recognition that we become blind to the reality of life and our true nature. We give priority to material instead of what we actually are, giving too much attention and desire to the material world itself. That's the problem, not living your life virtuously in order to become a holy man. You already are enough. Your soul is that. You should still live virtuously and follow those social virtues in order to get along in the material world in your day-to-day life, and again to purify yourself so that you can later elevate. But it's not something that is going to damn your soul or harm your soul. Again, not a Christian. The images, the material world, or what have you, they're just like a thin covering over reality, or the spirit. This matter itself is ephemeral, and life exists underneath that thin veneer. It seems real, but it's more like the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. If you're not, go look that up. The allegory, pretty simple. The soul itself doesn't have much actual relation to the physical world. It's fine how it is, even when stripped of all the usual markers of the self, such as thoughts or emotions. We still exist at a fundamental level, even without these conscious sensations. This level of purification is closer to the higher or highest levels of consciousness that Plotinus is getting at in all of his teachings. It's existence versus essence. Existence stems from the one, while essence is from the soul. So Brian Hines writes in his book, puts it like this, quote, "So spirit, through the intermediary of the soul, is the direct creator of all thoughts and things with which we are presently familiar." And then that sits on top of the one being the source. So now let's turn to turning inward. Direct attention above unity of life, thought, consciousness, where it all proceeds from. That's the next segment here, the next section. So let's talk about the practice of the virtues. It's about simplification and interior purification, so that we can later ascend and experience unification. This is a turning inward on the self, detaching from the day-to-day concerns as much as possible in order to try to make contemplation a continuous state. Of course, we still have to concern ourselves with the needs of our composite selves, the physical and social aspect of our existence. But as Hadow puts it, we must learn to illuminate it with the clear light that comes from contemplation. It is a seeing through of the world around us, going beyond just taking things at face value or our interpretations of the representations that we see around us. The material world isn't important, no matter how much it may seem to our ordinary vision and our interpretations of that ordinary vision. Our focus, our sense of joy should be directed towards the higher values, the higher levels, towards the one. Uniting our true self with the highest reality is the goal itself. And discursive reasoning can only take us so far, since the one is indescribable. It's something that has to be experienced. Thinking our way towards it won't really get us there. Thus, this is the contemplation focus that we find so much in Plotinus. Plenty of meditation would probably be in order to help us experience this. It's never referred to as meditation. It's always a contemplation instead. Even though he does have contact with Persian and Indian philosophy, I'm not sure he knows, because Buddhism would be later on, right? So, yeah, I don't think he has the whole tradition of meditation in the same way, but it's pretty much the same thing. In another excerpt from the book by Brian Hines, The One, he says, the message is exceedingly simple. Contemplate and become what truly is, genuine being, not shadows and reflections. Look within yourself and turn to a new way of knowing. Learn to be what you truly are. There is a spiritual world in Platonian thought. There is the One. It exists in both the inner and outer world. Two different levels of the same thing. Contemplation and purification helps to reveal all of this. As Hadow writes, by this method, there appears before our eyes the world of forms, which thus turns out to be the visible world, freed from its materiality, that is to say, reduced to its beauty. So we're seeing through the everyday, the shadows on the wall, the forms, whatnot, the reality underneath that is substantial, but you must dematerialize your vision, as Hines writes. In taking a quote from The Heart of Plotinus, he says, this kind of ecstasy, when the ego is obliterated and one sees the formless, regarded as a return to the supreme source, is a cosmic or rather divine event. It's not a temporal event in the history of this person. It exists outside of time, in illo tempore, dream time, sacred time. Like other things I've talked about on the podcast, we're leaving profane time and entering the sacred, at least on a spiritual level, while the body itself is still existing on the level where time exists, and things are still happening in a historical sense on that plane. But our spirit, our soul, has ascended to union with the One. Okay, getting it more into my thoughts on Plotinus and relating it to shamanism and what I noticed in this. There seems to be a randomness to ascension. You do all this preparatory work. It comes on at random times, though. You can't control it. You can't induce it step by step like you can in other traditions. Then you're just brought back to the world, to your daily life, but you're no longer the same. However, you're also no longer a being at the higher level. I think this is from Hadow, where he says, quote, the soul's highest state is complete passivity, and she tries to maintain herself in this state. Platonian love, by contrast, refuses to return to the day-to-day activity. It redescends to the world only when forced to do so by the needs of the human condition. You can't really maintain yourself in the state in Platonian philosophy, at least not while you're alive. You always have to come back to the so-called real world, but it also changes you once you have experienced the ascension. And then Hines says in his book, quote, so long as we are here in this world, we should see human life as it is. Shadow people acting out shadow roles on a shadow stage. It's very similar to shamanism, at least some shamanistic traditions in the world in some respects, except there are more, within those traditions, there's more explicit instructions in their rituals, usually induced by drumming or to a lesser extent taking psychedelic drugs. So in Michael Harner's books, especially in, Cave and Cosmos, he breaks down pretty much step by step exactly how to prepare yourself for these shamanistic journeys. You can buy the drumming audio files. You have your questions for the spirit realm or the beyond, the beings who live in the beyond, the spirits, the ancestors, whatever you call them. You have your questions ready for them. You meet some kind of power animal. You have your questions answered, at least symbolically, usually by the animal or the ancestors. So in that tradition, it's an involved process, but you have clear results. While Plotinus is about contemplation in the two levels of virtues, and something maybe eventually happens for you. You can't control it, just whatever. So in that sense, it's kind of more like meditation, but meditative traditions are much more structured, even if these experiences do come on randomly, I guess, to an extent, even though you can make yourself go through the levels of jhanas, at least the level 4 or 5 jhana. That's more of a step-by-step process that you can experience as a more advanced practitioner. I don't know. But once that does, the experience does happen, you do ascend to your union with the One. The return is at least pretty similar to the shamanic experience. You're always part of that higher space, the beyond thereafter. You never fully integrate back into the day-to-day. As Heido says, quote, "From now on, however, we won't be able to stand being down here. Henceforth, we don't belong anywhere. We are too terrestrial to be able to keep the divine gift, but have now become too divine to forget it." Many tribal shamans will experience something along those lines. Some more detailed, like in some traditions they'll have a separate family or life that exists in the beyond. They get to meet helping spirits and reproduce and have full relationships with those. But Plotinus's vision doesn't go into anything like that. So you don't exactly get the same experience at all. There's just these little overlaps in how it's all structured. And plus, the shamanic realm is usually the beyond, the afterlife, sort of, where the spirits and ancestors inhabit, very close to real waking life visually, with differences in how physical reality function in that realm. So you are transported to a higher or a different plane of existence, but it's still very much a visual experience like the real world, even if the rules don't apply and you're not subject to the same constraints of time, as you're not bound by the constraints of time in Plotinus's thought. In Plotinus, there really isn't much of a description from what I've seen as to what is actually involved once you've gotten to that higher state. The One is the baseline of all these things, of all things, but it's not a trippy type of experience, apparently. Not big on seeing in that regard, even though there's this constant relation back to vision in his thought, in his talks. From the Heart of Plotinus book, it sums up this idea thusly. So, quote, "Plotinus always speaks of the unity experienced at this level in terms of light and vision, although he emphasizes the fact that this, quote, seeing must be understood metaphorically, not in terms of having a real object present before the eyes. In shamanism, seeing refers to perceiving with all of your senses. Shamanism is revelatory, moving from this reality to the other. Seeing in these terms is different from the vision idea that we find in Plotinus. Plotinus says, if you have become this and seen it and become pure and alone with yourself, with nothing now preventing you from becoming one in this way, and have nothing extraneous mixed with yourself, if you see that this is what you have become, then you have become vision. Be confident in yourself. You have already ascended here and now, and no longer need someone to show you the way. Open your eyes and see." So, while researching this, while looking at this, I was like, is this just a trance-like state? Is it a feeling, a dissolving of the boundaries, or was there an actual visual component? That was my main question while reading. And he does talk about moving away from images, that what we see is like a film covering the spiritual, again, the day-to-day life. You get these, while looking at the world, other people, animals, whatever, the landscape, you get glimpses of beauty in these images, but they're also covering something more beyond that. I'm pretty sure it's just a formless state, since the One is beyond all forms. It seems to be closer to a meditative state. Yet Heido, in his book, writes that it isn't the same thing as nirvana in that tradition. Maybe it's more like abiding non-duality. Heido writes, "This spiritual world was not for him, Plotinus, a supra-terrestrial or supra-cosmic place. Rather, the spiritual world was nothing other than the self at its deepest level. It could be reached immediately by returning within oneself. If that's the case, then I've experienced what he's talking about through meditation and serious contemplation in the past. Plotinus didn't have quite the whole Eastern tradition to access like I do. He did get that Persian and Indian education again, to some extent. Just not the same kind of thing. Maybe he didn't have the proper terminology to explain it in the same way you can get with modern Buddha or later Buddhist texts or more modern interpretations of all that. The author of The Heart of Plotinus says, therefore, nous is attained by turning within and leaving sense perception behind. The world of forms or spiritual lights is the object of mystical experience, though the undifferentiated unity corresponds to the first hypostasis, the One. And Brian Hines writes in his book, Return to the One, quote, Plotinus tells us to shun our senses, silence our emotions, and shut down our thinking. What's going to be left of me? Well, what's going to be left is reality minus materiality, creation without a covering. I guess it's way less like a psychedelic or shamanic vision, more like what you'd experience with meditative practice, a very luminous, ecstatic state. It makes sense, as a huge part of Plotinian practice is that everyday contemplation, making every day a contemplation in itself, not just sitting down and meditating, but trying to keep that as a practice throughout the day. But at the same time, the ordinary daily world is distinct from this union with the One. It still comes on randomly, even with the practice of virtues and contemplation. Hines, in his book, says consciousness is like a screen, and the receiver of the television that can pick up multiple channels that are broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But you're only allowed to tune into one channel at a time. The connection between the everyday and the ecstatic is still there with the practice of the virtues, just not at that constant high-level experience that you get when you're at the highest level of consciousness, the union with the One. The lack of predictability as to when you get to experience is a distinct difference with all of this between the Neoplatonic philosophy versus other things, other practices. Even in lots of meditative practices, you can enter into the jhanas fairly regularly with some practice. Not even that much practice. Once you've calmed your thoughts down and you have a clear blueprint, it's not too difficult to enter, at least the first jhana. But that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. From the thought of Plotinus, from the books I read, nothing comprehensive or comparative with the rest of philosophy, just what I found interesting. To close things out here, another excerpt from The Simplicity of Vision. The most effective mode of action is pure presence. The good acts on the spirit by its mere presence. The spirit acts on the soul, and the soul on the body, all by their presence alone. There is thus no struggle against the self, no spiritual combat in Plotinian asceticism. It is enough that the soul contemplate turning herself towards God, for all of being down to its most inferior components to be transformed.